very much, Helen. Welcome to the opening session of today's conference, which asks the question, can agroecological farming square the circle for nature, net zero and food security? And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Tim Benton from Chatham House, David Edwards from WWF-UK, and Jyoti Fernandes from the Landworkers Alliance. And we hope at 11:15 we'll be joined by the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, George Eustace. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. Here we go. Ask questions first of the panellists after their contributions, and later from the Secretary of State. And the way to do that for all of you both in the room and the 700 or so online is through Menti. So for those of you in the room, log into the Wi-Fi, go to menti.com, and if you put in that code that's on the screen now, then you'll be able to pop in your question, but you'll also be able to vote up other people's questions that you'd really like to hear answered. And then obviously we won't be able to get to them all, but hopefully we'll be able to get to a pertinent few. The backdrop for today's conference was due to be the Global Biodiversity Summit, COP15, in Kunming, before it was pushed back again to August, and we hear that it may be pushed back yet again. It does remain hugely relevant context for today. Here in England, the Environment Act has put on the statute book for the first time a legal biodiversity target, which should be a game changer for farming and land use policy, the new net zero for nature, up there with the Climate Act. We cannot afford to deprioritise net zero in any way, but we are now legally, as well as morally bound, to put farming and land use onto a pathway to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And that has to include at least halving pesticide use and artificial nitrogen fertiliser use. The draft targets for COP15 are proposing a 2/3 reduction in pesticide use, but the UK government has yet to signal its support for that proposal. Of course, farming transformation is not an academic question or a future scenario anymore. It is happening. With the Ukraine invasion, food security has gone right up the agenda, but it's resilience that is what stands out as what's most needed in the face of the geopolitical, the climate, the public health shocks that we're all facing. We need a farming sector that is resilient in the face of volatile input and energy costs. We need more nutritionally diverse food production so that each of us and the NHS is more resilient because we're being fed a healthier diet. We've had this year two hugely relevant attempts to square the circle, to find that joined up pathway for nature and net zero and healthy food production. The first, Helen mentioned, the brilliant work of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission with IDRI, Farming for Change, and the second, WWF's Land of Plenty, which they both conclude that an agroecological pathway is the optimum strategy. We've also had IDRI's landmark work with CIRA, the French government's research body, which looked at the implications for global food security and trade. And that work concluded that a mainstream agroecological transition in Europe would actually shift Europe from being a net importer of calories to a net exporter of calories. At the moment, it is the world that is feeding us rather than the other way around. The reason it would shift us to being a net exporter of calories is by dramatically reducing our reliance on imported animal feed crops. Today, Chatham House brings fresh analysis to the table. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Tim Benton. Tim leads the Environment and Society programme at Chatham House and from 2011 until 2016 was the champion of the UK's Global Food Security Programme, which was a multi-agency partnership of the UK's public bodies with an interest in the challenges around food. He is also the chair of the Soil Association's Innovative Farmers Programme, and will be hosting a major international conference at Chatham House to mark that anniversary, the 10th anniversary of Innovative Farmers later this year. Tim, over to you.
Well, hello everybody. It's lovely to be back in real life and with so many friends and colleagues from so many years. I'm going to try and squeeze a very large amount into a very short period of time. So hopefully the slides that I quickly whiz through are covering well-known ground for everybody. But let's just start off setting the context. Why do we need to think about a different form of food system? It is because our food system is failing us in multiple ways, particularly from an environmental and health care costs. So we know it's responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, of which 2/3 come from livestock. We know that it's the major driver of biodiversity loss in the world, major land use change, major polluter in the world. And poor diets on a global basis is the #1 cause of sickness and mortality. And just as a kind of aside, one of the reasons that people like me focus on meat is not because we're anti-meat, it's because the statistics associated with animal source foods on a global basis are very, very large. 66% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the food systems associated with livestock, around 80% on a global basis of global land use, and 18% of calories. And a relatively small shift in global production of animal source foods can make a very big difference to the land use above. And I don't think anybody really ever argues for moving towards vegetarian diets. It's about the shift of how much meat should we be eating in our diets. So don't take anything I say today as being anti-livestock sector. It's much more about less and better than it is about thinking how can we change away from meat consumption. So diets, as I mentioned, #1 global cause of mortality. All over the world, poor diets underpin global ill health. In the rich world, it's typically associated with too many calories and all the rest of that. But just as another brief aside, this colour here, this kind of light green colour, which is the excess mortality associated with foods of around 180 to 200 or so, that is about what the excess mortality caused by COVID in 2020. And if you look at what poor diets is doing on a global basis, on average, it's about that sort of source of mortality for many countries. And in total, in 2020, overall, many more people died from ill health globally due to diets than from COVID. And yet diets are invisible for most of our thinking about particularly agriculture. Increasingly, we're talking about food systems and the role of diets in nutrition, and then linking that up to agriculture. But just as an aside, we are very nervous about the mortality caused from COVID, and yet we need to make this much more front and central when we think about food. And one of the issues is that there is a global mismatch between what is a healthy diet and what we produce. So on the left-hand side is a kind of pie chart of what we should be eating, according to the American Healthy Eating Plate. On the right-hand side is what we produce globally, stripping out animal feed. So we produce 1/3 as much fruit and vegetables as we should do if everybody chooses to eat healthily, 50% more cereals and starches, 4 times more oil and fats, and so on, 16 times more sugar or 15 times more sugar than we should do. So when we're thinking about what should a sustainable food system look like, it's not about producing more in a more efficient way. We have to fundamentally ask the question, what should we be growing? How much should we grow? And what are the kind of balances of arable, horticulture, and meat? I talk a lot about food systems. Many people do these days with Post-Food System Summit. The food system is just the complexity of everything from farm to consumption, waste, and so on. And this is my cartoon that I've been showing for years and years. The point is that it's complex. And complex systems tend to have feedback loops and reinforcing loops and buffering loops and so on. And if we want to increase this, nutrition, health and well-being, why do we only ever or usually consider that production in the hope that it goes all the way through over here? And the contention of those people who work on food systems is that we have to get much more thinking about the reverse. How can we incentivize this bit, the demand side, to feed back into the right sort of production rather than just assume that we tweak production to make diets better? And part of the reason for the kind of food systems approach is to break out from the kind of traditional thinking that there's a demand out there and our job in agriculture is to meet that demand by increasing supply. And part of the challenge that was first really highlighted by William Stanley Jevons back in 1867 or something, this august gentleman, he was a coal economist, and he pointed out that if you make coal-fired power stations more efficient, you should use less coal. But what happened? We made coal-fired power stations more efficient. Demand for energy therefore went up because energy was cheaper, so we used more coal. And so within the food system, the same thing applies. The more we supply, the more we innovate to supply, the more we raise demand. And so then this notion that there is a demand out there that we have to keep on meeting just drives us ever more to grow production, to meet demand. Demand grows, we grow production, and that is a vicious cycle of intensification. That means the land area expands and our intensification of the crop production expands. Many examples of that, I won't have time to go through them. But part of the challenge of this space is to get away from thinking about productivity and efficiency as metrics of sustainability. Because we can increase the productivity and efficiency of producing something, reduce its environmental footprint, but if demand is growing and we sell more of it, the aggregate impact goes up. So the footprint of food does not map neatly onto the sustainability of food because of this Jevons paradox approach. And so many of you will have seen these graphs before. If you look back at the last 60 years of data, this is cereal yield as a proxy of intensification on a global basis. This is price. This is availability per person on a global basis. As you can see, those two lines are linear. The more we've intensified, the more we've made food available, the more we've made it cheaper. This is the same graph in terms of proxy for intensification. This is a measure of environmental impact, if you like, food waste. This is a measure of health, of prevalence of obesity in females. What you can see is as we intensify, we reduce prices, increase the economic rationality of wasting food, food waste goes up. We reduce prices, make food more available, people eat more, obesity goes up. The key thing to note is that these are curves, that's a straight line, so the costs are increasing faster than the benefits. And so the more we intensify, the more we drive this vicious circle, the more we lead to negative outcomes, and therefore we have to get out of this cycle. So we need to focus, if we're thinking about a sustainable food system, we need to focus more on what is grown. We know all sorts of things about what makes a healthy diet, but rather than saying, how do we grow more? How do we drive up productivity and do it in the most environmental efficient way? We ought to focus much more on these four questions. Right, now on to the meat of this. Okay, so my background is in agroecology and the scientific discipline as opposed to the movement. And there's lots of data now around, this is a kind of caricature graph, biodiversity against yield. You can also have a similar shaped curve for greenhouse gas emissions and yield or whatever. You get the most biodiversity in natural ecosystems when you're not taking any yield out. As you go down to increase yields, you reduce biodiversity. The key thing about this graph is that it's a curve again. It's not a straight line. If it was a straight line, life would be very different. So if you think about nature-friendly farming, somewhere in the middle, seems like a good idea to balance nature and agriculture. But because this curve is a curve, you pay a penalty in biodiversity or you pay a penalty in yield, or both, depending on how you view it, relative to leaving the land in the natural state or intensifying the land. And this leads to the notion that it's more efficient on an aggregate level to save some land for nature and to intensify the hell out of the bits of agricultural land, because in theory you get more of both produce and biodiversity. And this is the land sparing sustainable intensification ideology, really. But of course, we know that the world is a messy place, and actually there are very few examples where sustainable intensification and land sparing actually work to deliver more of other things. And there's lots of literature about this that's available, and anybody who wants me to give them some pointers, please email me. The other way we can think about things is to say, well, if we actually change the demand side, so we change the balance of meat versus of crops, or the amount of food that we choose to eat, reduce overconsumption or reduce waste or whatever, we could get by producing less. And if we could produce less, we could, theoretically, spare land for nature and farm somewhere in the middle, because if we're demanding less, the yield costs of farming in a nature-friendly way matter less, because demand goes down. And of course, that requires what people call behavioural change from consumers. And so, it's a no-no. But we focus on this, a colleague and I, Helen Harwood at Chatham House, we focus on looking at the assumptions between these two models of sustainable agriculture in a paper that's coming out on May 24th. If anybody wants to go on the list to receive a copy of the paper, please give your cards to Ludi, who's waving over there, or send me an email. And then we'll just ping you a copy when it comes out. And really, we're looking at what do people assume if they say land sparing versus sustainable intensification? Or what do people assume if they say let's change diets and go with land sharing and land sparing? And just to give you a kind of quick whiz through, if you go down the argument for sustainable intensification and land sparing, then effectively you make a set of key assumptions, or those key assumptions are made in the narrative discourse around why that is a good model for agriculture. And these are the kind of 5 main assumptions. First of all, well, demand is going to increase. It's obviously going to increase because we've got more people on the planet and they're getting richer. So demand is an exogenous variable in this. It's outside the food system and we have to meet demand. That growing demand means that we have to increase productivity, is the next assumption. We need to raise that supply. Dietary change is difficult. Demand is going to increase. We can't change that demand. We can't change diet. So therefore, we have to carry on intensifying. It's not the preserver policy. Sustainable intensification, we can do more. If only we invest, is the next assumption. If only we can invest in technology, we'll be able to produce as much as we want to. And then, if we intensify the hell out of bits of ground, of course, that will enable us to spare land for nature. So those are the kind of key assumptions of let's make our agriculture land spared plus sustainable intensification. And of course, each one of these is critiquable. Demand is not exogenous. Demand, as I said with the Jevons paradox stuff, demand is often made by the system. And we know that in the past that diets have changed radically over the last decades. They will change radically into the future. And particularly as we start saying that health becomes really important, the potential for diets to change in the right way it's very much there. If the market demands more, do we have to supply it? We can correct market failure, and the role of government is often seen to intervene when markets are failing. So if meeting supply is leading to environmental and health externalities, do we have to go with demand is there, therefore we have to supply? That's an assumption. It is not a given. Dietary change is difficult. It's not the preserver policy. we use policy as levers all the time to change behaviour. We change tobacco consumption, we change alcohol consumption, drug consumption, petrol prices through taxation, etc. We're using the demand side levers of change all the time to change behaviour. The potential for technological-led sustainable intensification is large. Yes, this may be true, but it always comes with trade-offs. So if you want to double wheat yields, it might be theoretically possible, but all things being equal, you will use more nitrogen. If you're using more nitrogen, that's going to have more pollution effects, more air quality effects, and so on. So can we navigate those trade-offs? Then land sparing is enabled. Actually, when you look at the literature, what happens most is that when you intensify areas, unless you have the quid pro quo of very strong governance, the area under agriculture expands because the incentives to convert land increase. So actually, intensification drives land conversion rather than spares land. So that's vision 1. Vision 2, key assumptions. So vision 2 being, we can feed the world agroecologically, and to do so, we can adopt low waste and sustainable healthy diets, effectively. So the key assumptions of this: demand can be changed. The current unsustainability of farming is a form of market failure and should be corrected. A healthy diet is also a more sustainable one. Agroecological approaches can supply sufficient sufficient nutrients if consumption patterns change. Agroecological approaches are more sustainable than sustainable intensification. And again, you can critique all of these. Demand can be changed. It is changing, but it is difficult politically. It's not about data, it's not about evidence, it's not about consumption behaviour change. It is about the structure of the markets and whether or not we want to intervene in markets. Politically difficult. Incumbency and all of those other power things make it difficult. It's not a science thing, it's not a human behaviour thing, it's a market thing. Healthy diet is also more sustainable. Yes, not necessarily, but yes, in general. Agroecological approaches can feed the world. Yes, they can, but only if we have radical change in the structure of the markets. The yield does not have to go up to feed the world. We've got plenty of calories in the world to feed everybody, even 11 billion people, but we feed them to livestock instead. Change that mix of what we feed to livestock. So part of the issue with Ukraine and Russia is that a small change in the consumption behaviour across Europe, 15% less monogastric consumption, would make up for all of the shortfall of grain that we're not going to import from Ukraine and Russia. We don't have to substitute that grain by growing more, ploughing up nature areas or whatever. A small change in diets can have a very big land use effect. Agroecological approaches are more sustainable. Thank you, David. Agroecological approaches are more sustainable. At the farm level, they are. If you look at the evidence base, at the farm level, you get more biodiversity, better soils, better this, better that, water, etc., typically on agroecological farms. The issue is they produce less. But if we're demanding less, the fact that they produce less doesn't matter so much. So the issue there is not, can we feed the world? Is there evidence that we can feed the world? It is the structure of the markets and the assumptions that we make about whether or not supply has to be met, or whether or not we can change demand by changing the structure of the markets and then farm in a different way. That's a question about markets, that's a question about politics, that's not a question about science and farming. So just briefly, I want to touch on Ukraine. So Helen, I think, or was it Joe said, you know, so many things have happened. We're living in a world of permanent crisis. This is a figure that I keep on updating, which is things that have happened this century. And of course, the latest thing is Ukraine. If you just think back through, we have had financial crisis, we've had 2 food price crises, we've had the rise of nationalism, we've had pandemics, we've had messy exit from Afghanistan, we've had trade wars, etc., migration crisis, pandemics, etc. You know, lots of things going on. And I just wanted to put in that back in 2016, we were involved in doing a scenarios exercise looking at, for the World Economic Forum, looking at what might shape the future of agriculture. And in typical scenarios, food systems that was, in typical scenarios exercises, you look for the things that you know are going to be important, but you're most uncertain about. And in this exercise, we chose two axes in 2016. One is unsustainable and healthy diets versus sustainable. Are people going to shift, or is the system going to shift to drive that? And the other one was whether or not the world was going to get more regionalized, local, or more globalized. And back at the time, pre-Trump, et cetera, the world seemed to be more or less on course for going up here, a more stable world, more global interconnections, etc. But if you think, so I put this slide together years ago, if you think about the last few years, what have we had? Growth of protectionism, growth of nationalism, breakup of rules-based international cooperation, war terrorism, etc., etc. We are moving, Larry Fink said a couple of weeks ago, we're moving into a new world of deglobalization and regionalization. And therefore, our assumptions about the world getting ever more integrated and us being a nice, safe exporting country and importing country in a world that's stable, allowing us to grow things that we're good at growing, export them and import the difference, is a questionable assumption as we look ahead. And if you just think about these two sectors, if you think about global food systems in a globalized world, supplying healthy diets, you would trade on comparative advantage on a global basis. You would have commodity crops, large-scale agriculture, etc. You would engineer in nutrition. But if you're moving towards a regionalized food system, because the world is unstable and you don't trust trade or you can't trade so much, you need to produce more varied diets. You need to have a different form of farming system to produce those more varied diets. You've got to have a better linkage between health policy and agricultural policy. You need to focus on low waste systems because you can't afford to waste anymore. And therefore you end up with quite a different food system. So just winding down now, we know the Ukraine crisis is currently leading to a very big food, energy and fertilizer price spike. It might increasingly drive economies on a global basis or a regional basis to onshore. There's lots of talk, particularly in minerals and metals, semiconductors, about how do we onshore stuff. That argument is just starting around food. As the crisis unfolds, we're moving into a place where the geopolitics of the future look very different to the geopolitics of today. So we could end up very much in a few years' time with a bipolar world with two big trading blocks, each trading internally and trading less across. What does that do to who we buy from, who we sell to? What does that do to food prices? If Russia is permanently out of the equation, fertilizer prices are going to stay high for a very long time. Food prices might come down, but fertilizer prices are likely to stay high. What does that drive us as a farming system to do? Does it make us think in different ways about our traditional let's drive up productivity approach by intensification? So the current situation is not about a food and energy price, fertilizer price spike. It's also about long-term structural change in markets and trade that provide an opportunity or a threat, depending on which way you're doing things, for driving the system in a different direction. And then just, we published a report on Ukraine-Russia last week before, where we looked at some of the policy options about what we should be doing for food and energy. And there are a lot of things that, on the demand side, incentivize more sustainable diets. On the agriculture side, diversify agriculture, incentivize agroecological farming, blah, blah, blah. The one thing that we shouldn't be doing is thinking about expanding the area of agriculture to make up for the lost supplies that we might get, because that locks us into a dysfunctional system for longer and undermines our ability to meet all of the other targets that we need to do. So just in conclusions, the vision for what a sustainable food system is, and therefore the vision for what sustainable agriculture is, whether it's intensification plus land sparing or agroecology, is not so much about the science, it's about the assumptions that we make, particularly about whether markets are there for that need to be, supply needs to be fulfilled for demand, or whether markets are there to deliver better public goods outcomes in terms of can we change the structure of the markets in ways that achieve health on a human basis, planetary health on a planetary basis, and so on. And depending on how you view the market and the role of the market, productivity growth is not a necessary precondition of making a sustainable food system. It depends on your view of whether the market takes priority or whether the market should be shaped by public goods. We know food system transformation is needed. Productivity growth and land sparing is unlikely because of Jevons paradox to lead to the outcomes that we need. We need structural market change, I think. And the current cost of living crisis is not a necessary driver for producing more, any more than the current energy crisis is a driver for us drilling more oil wells in the North Sea. By the time they come on stream, we'll have solved all this energy crisis. What we should be doing is insulating homes to reduce our current need for energy. Same way with this crisis, what we shouldn't be doing is producing more. What we should be using it is as an opportunity to help move the system in a new direction, and that new direction is towards an agroecological future, I would suggest, that clearly includes livestock agriculture as part of the agricultural system, but not an intensive with a bit of land sparing on the side. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tim. There's a huge amount in that, and the questions will be flooding in. I was particularly struck by what you said about it would take just a 15% reduction in pigs and poultry, Europe to make up for the shortfall in grain after the Ukraine-Russia invasion, and really showing that what's at stake is not food security so much as the future of Europe's industrial livestock sector. Really fascinating stuff. Now, let me introduce David Edwards. David is Director of Food Strategy at WWF-UK and sits on WWF's Global Food Leadership Team. Prior to joining WWF, David served for 10 years as Assistant Director of HRH, the Prince of Wales's International Sustainability Unit. Over to you, David.
And thank you, Jo, and thank you, Tim. I mean, that was just a masterful performance, I thought. And thanks for giving us so much to chew on. I was reflecting on your two visions of land sparing and land sharing, and I thought one set of critiques seemed to, as you were saying, very scientific, the other one's very political. It reminded me of what Churchill, I think, said about, it is not sufficient for us to only think about what is possible. The challenges that confront us require us to think about what is necessary. I think that's the critical distinction, really, between the challenge or the critiques that were laid out. Now, I'd like to preface my comments with a short profiling snippet of our Land of Plenty report. I hope you'll forgive me, because this report, I think, contains a vision for UK agriculture that is, in many ways, answers to the questions that we were asking today. So, take it away. Thank you for your attention on that. So at WWF, we call the food, climate and nature crisis a triple challenge. 3 agendas that are intimately linked and we fervently believe need to be addressed as a whole. In our Land of Plenty report that you just saw a trailer for, we provide a positive vision for how that triple challenge might be addressed, in particular through the transition to agroecology. Our study reveals the extra potential for agroecology to enable our farming to deliver far greater emission reductions than had previously been thought. Indeed, those benefits are not insignificant. This is just about how things are grown, not what is grown at this stage. Equivalent to 900,000 cars coming off our roads. And that's within a transition that will also help us reduce our international footprint and restore nature in the UK. The report also shows the huge opportunity for farmers here, increasing both their economic resilience by reducing the UK's demand for feed and fertiliser, but also their inherent resilience to climate change through the improvement to soil health and agricultural ecosystems. So we've shown what it might be possible. Our ask really is for the government now to give the farmers the confidence that they urgently need by bringing forward their own comprehensive decarbonisation strategy for food and land use in this country, and one that puts nature at its heart. To this end, and as Joe reminded us earlier, given that we now have a legal obligation under the Environment Act, we feel that it is right if the government enables the CCC in its work to take a far more integrated view. Now, one of the key instruments that we think can be used here is the development of a nitrogen strategy, working with governments to set nitrogen targets or nitrogen budgets with the overall aim of halving nitrogen waste by 2030. This is going to be good for farming business and good for the planet. Alongside just a third of our farm sector emissions are due to this nitrogen, so much other environmental harms come from the misuse and waste of nitrogen. And that wasted nitrogen is a huge economic burden. It is, I think, equivalent to half of all of our agricultural sector's profits in this country, £2.2 billion a year. We're just washing into our rivers and out into our oceans. The second weakness that we think needs to be addressed in a carbon strategy, a carbon reduction strategy, would be the incorporation of off-farm or Scope 3 emissions, chiefly those that are associated with imported feeds and fertilisers. These are not yet being factored in to our climate accounting for agriculture. They're out of sight, out of mind, but they account for as much as 40% of all of our agricultural emissions. Any pathway must include actions to reduce demand for those hidden emissions. Now, the challenge of our global footprint also requires us to establish some core environmental standards for all food that's available in the UK, so that the transition to a better farming future in the UK is not undermined by the import of potentially lower standard foods from abroad. Now, as Tim has made abundantly clear, I think, the real juice here is that a just transition to agroecology cannot happen without significant shifts in diet, including a move away from industrialised animal feed and livestock. Such changes are indeed the single most important factor in enabling the change that we need. We urgently need a joined-up conversation about diets in this country linked to the food and farming system that we want. And yet, as we stand, we see that there's silence on this from our net zero strategies. It's simply unfair on farmers who are trying to do the right thing for nature for the government to be shying away from this critical issue. And I can also say from our work with retailers and banks that it is a frustration to them. At COP last year, we got the 5 major UK retailers in this country, including Tesco's, to sign up to a set of commitments on nature and climate. Including within those commitments was the reduction, a sea change in the protein offer by 2030. But they need help. They recognise that ambition is required. They recognise the truth that Tim was saying there, but they need help in achieving it. In a world where things have to change, the lack of coherent leadership from a pro-business government such as we have is holding them back. Ultimately, I think we actually have an amazing moment to create positive and long-term change in this country. We have 3 immensely powerful potential drivers. We have the Net Zero plan, we have a Nature Recovery Act, and we have the agricultural transition. And the key decisions around these issues are being made right now. It is, as Tim says, not a matter of science, it's a matter of political will. What this moment needs is leadership, and I very much look forward to hearing what Minister Eustace has to say to make good on that call. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. It's a staggering figure you share, that £2.2 billion, so equivalent to half of all farming profits, goes in nitrogen loss each year. I think that's a very memorable statistic. Land of Plenty was, in our view, a really important piece of work, and it should be a great source of evidence for the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, in the job that they're going to have to do now to revise their climate-centric land use pathway in light of the new Environment Act Biodiversity target. Now let me introduce Jyoti Fernandes. Jyoti manages a mixed organic smallholding in Dorset, producing beef, lamb, cider, apple juice, fruit and vegetables. And she somehow manages to combine this with being the campaigns and policy coordinator for the Landworkers Alliance, a farmers' union in the UK, and is one of the leading lights of Via Campesina, which is comprised of 300 million small and family farmers across the globe. Jyoti.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I managed to do that because I'm a part of a massive, beautiful agroecological web that stretches across the planet. Small and family farmers, indigenous people, small-scale fisher people, people who have their hands in the ground, on the earth, or at the markets, who are processing massive vats of food and feeding it to their families every single day, feeding our planet. And, that support network plus the people who work together to try and build a stronger, better, fairer, more equitable society, they're all behind me and they're with me, and they make this possible, that we can actually really create a positive future where we have enough food to feed everybody healthy, organic food every day, including future generations. So I'll describe my farm a little bit. I have a 20 hectare farm. It's 43 acres shared between 2 families, and there's another family that comes on, in fact, 2 young couples that also run sub-enterprises on our small area of land. Overall, there's a huge amount of employment for the amount of acreage that we've got. I've got orchards, and they're all traditional varieties of apples, pears, and plums with rare breed sheep grazing underneath, and then lots of market garden, and the fertilizer from the market garden comes from a handful of cows that we milk and produce meat from, that we collect the manure from, and that manure gets composted and put back onto the market garden. So we've got a really strong fertility cycle going forward on our land. And we process our food through a cooperative. There's cooperatively owned processing facilities where over 50 smallholders in our area can come together and use those processing facilities to add value to their products and sell them through local markets. So, you might think, okay, this is a pretty small farm. And in many people's minds in the UK, they would start to class this as a hobby farm, as something that's a bit romantic, a relic from the past, where we're thinking about all these heritage varieties and, these, ways of doing things by hand and spending a lot of time at markets, chatting to our customers when we sell our products. But in the larger picture, the web of small farms across the world that is actually feeding so many people is comprised of these little units. And there's a figure from the ETC group, it's a think tank that thinks globally, looking at the picture of where we get our food security from. It says 80% are our global food security, and that means the food that actually gets to people, not the yield of the amount of food that's produced, but our actual food security is provided by the agroecological food web, this web of small and family farms, indigenous people, fisher people across the world that are producing the majority of our actual global food security. The food that goes through people having subsistence plots where they provide food for their own family, the webs that are feeding their local community, the markets that stretch across Africa and Asia and Latin America, where people are out there vending the wares that they grow themselves to the regional areas. Those agroecological food webs that are producing food that's in harmony with the natural environment that's around them, produced in a myriad of different ways, this amazing variety of different ways and knowledge and techniques and deep understanding of the land to feed people. And what's interesting about it is that it's not about yield. It's about politics. It's about who owns and controls the land, because we still have hunger in the world. We have a food system that's pushing us to depletion. All the facts that Tim was describing to us, I don't need to go into those details because he's actually described them to us. But one thing that I will address is where I feel there was a gap in what you said, in that we need, you said we need restructuring of the markets. It's not just restructuring the markets, it's restructuring of society and how we face inequality in distribution of resources. And that is the fundamental reason why we have so much more food in terms of yield being produced today, but we still have a huge amount of people going hungry, facing not only acute hunger, but nutritional deficiencies. And at the same time, we have a huge amount of food waste and people facing obesity and health-related crises related to obesity. There is something structurally wrong with how those distribution of resources is happening. And that is a societal issue that we've got to address head on, not just through markets, but how we actually think about addressing inequality. And it's something that we need to think about deeply in terms of policy and political solutions. And there's a lot of emphasis here, I find, when I work with the agriculture department. Our farmers union works very strongly with all the programs run by DEFRA and tries to apply a lot to the agricultural innovation funds. We're forever hitting a wall, especially when we try to apply for UK RI funding, in trying to understand that the innovations we need to actually solve a lot of these problems are social innovations. They're supply chain innovations. They're innovations that think about how we deal with increasing biodiversity and climate change practice in the middle of our farms through knowledge-intensive solutions. We're always hitting this wall because there's something that says, there's a mentality that has been perpetrated for quite a long time, and a root of quite a lot of this problem where we're facing so many people in acute hunger now is that there's this mentality that increasing yield, that high-tech solutions are really the way we're going to feed people, when actually we need to think about their social innovations. And I'm going to give an example of a few of these, because really I think the sphere where we need to do a lot of work is access to land and resources, and how we think about innovations to increase that access, public procurement, and then supply chains. And that has to do with cooperatives and getting farmers to work together cooperatively. Now, recently, I just got some funding, and quite a lot of it from the European Union Innovation Funding, to go and study in Brazil for a month. And what was stunning to me was the way that small farms were working together there to be able to put their produce together through cooperatives, through really large, well-run cooperatives, to be able to have processing and distribution hubs so that this produce could be distributed on a mass scale. And I visited our farmers union equivalent for small and family farms in Brazil. And so that they've settled over 450,000 families on 10-hectare plots, 10-hectare farms managed agroecologically. And then they've set up over 400 cooperatives where they manage centrally the collection of the produce in distribution hubs, and then have factories for producing juices, preserves, packaging, of meats and staple grains in ways that each of those farms wouldn't be able to do on their own. And 70% of what's being collected from these 450,000 farms is being sold through public procurement to local schools and hospitals. So it's directly addressing food poverty and the fact that this good agroecological food produced on small farm units, providing a fair livelihood, because it's good prices that they're paying to all of these producers, and it's very important to them that it is paying a fair price because there's not a social security net like there is here, and that means that somehow that's addressing the fact that that food is accessible to the wider population in a way. It's here when it's very much market-led and you haven't got the policies that kind of help guide the fact that we want good quality food to be accessible to people in schools and in hospitals and in society that can't afford things. If it's all driven by the market, then organic food ends up being at fancy farmers markets, it ends up being in shops where it becomes a niche high-end product, and the farmers themselves may not want to be producing for those niche high-ends, but we need to make a fair living too. And that is something that can be addressed through an innovation in policy and an innovation in supply chains.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jyoti. Thank you so much for bringing the social dimension into it and really highlighting the role of procurement as a lever as well for building markets for agroecological farmers. We've got lots of questions that have come through. I was going to use Chair's prerogative to ask each of you to perhaps say what might be top of the to-do list for the Secretary of State, but I'll perhaps allow you to put those to him later. First take some questions that have come through from the audience. So first off, and I'll put this to Jyoti, if livestock are an essential component of low-input agroecological farming, what can be done to make agroecological livestock profitable at all scales? Linked to this, how do we encourage people to eat more of that meat and less industrial chicken?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, livestock does play an important role in a cyclical system. It's very important if you are a livestock-based farm to have that manure that you can, then compost and put back into the land. And the grazing that happens on many of our beautiful landscapes, for instance, I'm in the area of outstanding natural beauty, the grazing that happens there to conserve the wildlife of the beautiful meadows we've got it's important to have livestock there as a part of that system. But, in order to make a good value from producing a few livestock, then there's some certain tricks to it. It's about trying to produce a bit less, but add value to what you do produce. If you produce a cheese, try and make it something that, you're actually getting the profit back from making it into the cheese, or you're putting into a cooperative supply chain so that you can get that value back on what you're producing. And it's also about reducing your inputs. So, when we produce pork on our farm, we try and, use waste food products when possible that can be, obtained safely and legally. And also, reducing our reliance on imported grain and soya because they have such a deep impact on the Amazon. So I think policies that actually really look closely at how we can make that more sustainable, looking at the legality of trying to, integrate waste food into, feeding pig and poultry, and thinking how we can transition farmers over to more pasture-fed livestock, and how we can actually get some kind of supply chains that bring added value to producing a bit less livestock, but, getting more profit back to the farmer are the real keys there. And it'd be great to know from you what we can do with DEFRA to do that.
Fantastic. Question for Tim. Does Tim see a role for alternative proteins such as plant-based products and cellular agriculture in achieving an agroecological transition?
My suspicion is that just as in the energy transition space, the argument for alternative proteins is alternative proteins as a transition fuel like gases, a transition fuel towards the better place. But actually, most people eat far too much protein from a health perspective. We could just eat less protein. We don't have to have a transition. And my worry is that when you look at the sales statistics, the development of alternative proteins is causing an increase in the sale of meat, not a substitution, primarily because alternative proteins are in kind of typical burger form. And you can imagine a family dynamic where the teenagers say, we want to eat vegetarian, and dad says, no, I won't. We're only going to cook one meal and it's going to be burgers because that's easy. And so actually alternative proteins in a Jevons paradox way, like I was talking about earlier, are actually increasing meat consumption, not substituting for meat consumption. So there is a danger. Of course, The market loves it because it's a way of expanding the market. And the trouble, as I was saying in my talk earlier, is that unless we think about structural change in the market is always market expanding. It's always driving consumption. And so you're always chasing supply to meet demand.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question for David. Is poverty the largest barrier to achieving more sustainable and healthy diets? Globally, is it realistic to ask people in the UK to eat more sustainably in the context of a cost of living crisis?
Another easy one.
Good question.
Good question. And actually very pertinent to what we heard today from Tim, I think. I would suggest that the evidence is there that it isn't so much poverty that's the problem as the approach to the problem of poverty that is at issue. And I think as long as one properly incorporates, as a government, for example, the public goods associated with that poverty, there's no reason why one can't restructure. And the second part of the question, Joe, sorry.
Is it realistic to ask people in the UK to be eating a sustainable diet in the context of the cost of living crisis?
Gosh, another easy one. I think here we need to look at what short-term interventions the government can make to soften the blow. You know, we're incredibly sympathetic to this issue. This is not easy. This is incredibly difficult. I think, again, Tim's presentation was masterful at showing how difficult that was. That the debate around land sharing, land sparing is such that people perceive the fact that it is so very difficult as being impossible. So we're not saying this is easy, absolutely not saying this is easy. But I think we need to turn our attention to what are these sort of short-term measures that can cope with the issue without subverting the hugely important transition that we've mapped out here. You know, because if we don't do that, we're up a certain creek, aren't we? I mean, we have, I think there's evidence coming forth in the next couple of weeks to suggest that if we were just to delay the transition through ELM, it may halve the emissions reductions by 2030, completely knocking the whole mission off kilter. So now is not the time for delay, now is the time for leadership. I appreciate it's difficult.
And it does feel as if government has a really important lever as well they can pull in terms of procurement and standards and funding for food in schools and in nurseries. We always say at the Soil Association that every child should have at least one healthy and sustainable meal a day, and that is something government can provide in terms of a safety net while there's downward pressure on perhaps food standards at home. The cost of living crisis means that food in schools becomes more relevant, not less. Another question, we've got time for a couple more. So can I come back to you, David? Is that fair? If rewilding has a role in our food and farming system, how do we show that rewilding and agroecology can be mutually supportive, especially when the rewilding debate can be so divisive?
Thank you for that. Well, is it too cheeky to say, read our report? Indeed, that is one of the central sort of problems that the Land of Plenty report does try to address. And our analysis is that it is not impossible. These things do not need to be traded off. And yet we come back to this fundamental problem of how you spring the trap through this change of diet that is required. And I think what is important is that government understand the importance of this, and that the agenda that is in front of, the very tricky agenda around agricultural transition that is in front of the minister, is elevated above DEFRA. You know, it's not just a DEFRA issue. This is an issue that involves the Department of Trade. It involves the levelling up agenda. It involves health. It involves Treasury, of course. This is a whole of government agenda. And in thinking about the challenge that's been laid out by the National Food Strategy, I think we need to look to the government for a very strong response, as Helen was saying, in their white paper. And I think my biggest fear is that the government is not going to step up to that and is going to use the Ukrainian, or not use, the Ukrainian crisis is going to deflect them from doing that.
Well, perhaps we can wait to hear Jyoti's response to that. Final question, and this is for Tim. What role might the supply chain and supermarkets play in changing the structure of the market and consumer choices? Are supermarkets the problem, or can they be part of the solution?
No, no one is the problem with our market failure that exists at the moment, because everybody is, in a sense, playing by the rules of the game. And what we need to do is change the rules of the game to incentivise better outcomes. And that's what I mean by structural, because that has social issues, it has economic issues, it has food environment issues, etc. So if we were to say, on a global basis, take all the subsidies that go to grain and put them on fruit and vegetables would become more available, they'd become cheaper, grain would become more expensive, and animals would become more expensive because of the feed into animals. That in itself would create a significant change in consumer behaviour because of structural change in the markets. And of course, supermarkets would be very important in selling that food and delivering that food. But whilst there is this incentive simply to have a food system that makes the maximum profit without due regard to the environment, without due regard to human health, and without due regard to the resilience of the system, we're always going to get a very, very thin, fragile system that breaks down repeatedly and creates, through the Jevons paradox, worse spiralling impacts over time. And you only have to look back at the last 10 years and see how we've lived in crisis after crisis after crisis, and that's going to get worse in the future. At some point, we've got to think about this structural change, because otherwise it'll all just fall apart one of these days.
Well, that's a great way to pull it all together there in response to that last question, because I'm going to have to call a halt to questions now to allow me to introduce the Right Honourable George Eustace, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and Conservative MP for Camborne and Redruth. I believe we're approaching the 7th anniversary of your initial appointment as Minister of State in DEFRA in 2015. So it's fair to say that no one has been closer to this once-in-a-generation shake-up of farming policy for the duration. And we're delighted that you have agreed to show your support for today's conference with a keynote speech. So, Secretary of State, over to you.